walk away.
And if you're just joining us, we were listening in to U.S. Secretary of Marco Rubio speaking there on the final day of the ASEAN Summit of Foreign Ministers hosted by Malaysia. It was Rubio's first trip to Asia as U.S. Secretary of State, overshadowed by concerns about U.S. trade policy. Joining me on the set is our Foreign Affairs Editor, Philip Turle. Hello to you, Philip. Let's begin with some of the last points that Rubio was discussing throughout his press conference. He's been using the word constructive, whether it's with China, Japan, or with Russia. And that's where I want to begin, with Russia. What came out of that statement? We know he held talks with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, a couple of days ago, and then he followed up with him again recently. What did we learn?
Well, not much, I'm afraid. I think if any of the journalists there or us watching this were hoping that there would be some news about a move forward towards a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, then we're all left empty-handed, because all Marco Rubio would say was that he met with Sergei Lavrov to follow up on an unrelated item from yesterday, and that was all that he was willing to say. But he said then, when pushed again, maybe something was discussed between us that we could explore to a later date. But that was basically all he was willing to say. And as for talks due to take place on Monday, or announcements by President Trump on Monday, he said, well, we have to wait until Monday. I'm not going to say anything. So really no news coming out about any possible push by President Trump to try to force Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table, or not much information about the shipment of US weapons to Ukraine. He was basically saying, Marco Rubio, that most of the weapons that Ukraine needs are already in Europe. They're US-made weapons that Europe doesn't have the capacity to build. So he was encouraging the Europeans to ship those weapons to Ukraine, which would be easier than them coming directly from the United States. But the capacity already exists for those weapons to be shipped there, and that's what the Europeans should do. So that was basically all we got to learn about what was going on in Ukraine right now.
Yeah, most of those questions focusing on relations between the United States and China. Rubio said a meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping will happen, a high probability that it will happen this year. No date has been discussed, but this, of course, overshadowing all of this is a trade dispute between the two biggest economies in the world.
Well, a couple of issues, yes. He said that President Trump and President Xi are going to meet. No date yet, so we don't know whether it's going to be this year or early next year, but it appears that there is a plan to get the two leaders together. You're right, the tariffs were a subject of discussion. He said, however, Marco Rubio, this was not a negotiation. This was a meeting to achieve strategic stability and trust, and that public announcements about trade will come later. But he said the odds were high. In his view, the tariffs are not a threat. He said they're unfair for Americans. We're seeing this as a way of resettling global trade, as deficits are enormous. It needed to be done. President Trump is doing it. Most mature leaders see this as an unsustainable dynamic, and that's why the United States is coming in to try to create a more fair trading relationship through the tariffs. But he said the bulk of the meetings were not about tariffs. That was not his job. He was not in charge of negotiating tariffs. He was in charge of civil and nuclear agreements, international law, civil rights, airline rights. But he said whatever happens with any country that we're having a dispute with, we have to have relations with them, and that's why this meeting was important, because I met with many leaders and we all got on very well, and we all see eye to eye on many issues.
Yeah, but there has been speculation that amid this sort of uncertainty sparked by the Trump administration, that China could step in as a calm, steadying force, and that the U.S. Spin it as the U.S. as a destabilizing force in the region.
That is true. I think he was, Marco Rubio, trying to play this down as, well, look, this is the situation right now. We are the ones who've been penalized through the tariffs that we have been forced to pay. There is a huge imbalance in the trade deficit, and I can quite understand if you're a country that is not buying much from the US but exporting a lot to the US, then you don't want the situation to change. But the US is being penalized, and so are US citizens. That's why we're doing what we're doing. So it is the normal way forward, and most people, they understand that. There was an interesting comment about Japan. He said that he'd met the Japanese foreign minister 9 or 10 times so far since he'd been in office since the 20th of January. It was the foreign minister that he'd met the most out of any, saying that there's a joke between the two of them. We now see each other more than we see our respective wives. But he said Japan was trying to create its own military capacity that the United States is then going to encourage, because he says what we are interested in is collective self-defense, but Japan is free to go its own way if it wants to create its own self-defense. That is something the United States would encourage, and there are exercises taking place at the moment between Japan and the United States, so we don't have any problem with them moving away into their own direction as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, this idea that weaning itself off U.S. influence, Japan doing that, not necessarily a bad thing in the Trump administration's eyes. Philip Turle, thank you very much. We'll be talking about all these subjects and more throughout the day here on Paris Direct.